please email us. I'm happy to send you one of those packets, and we'll also post them online so that you can have them ahead of time. Welcome to this first of a three-part series on apocalyptic spirituality. And I will be stealing some of Alex Quick's thunder for a really wonderful sermon that he's going to be giving this morning at 10:15. But I won't steal all of his thunder, but talking a little bit about apocalypse and apocalyptic sensibilities. And I want to make sure that I don't forget what I called today's session, which is the end of the world as good news. And that's where I hope we will land on thinking about apocalyptic traditions and apocalyptic literature, which runs throughout the Advent season. To begin, first of all, my plan is to have a little bit of discussion with all of us this morning for just a little bit, and then I'll make some observations and remarks of my own, and then we'll have some more discussion. So discussion, Jay's observations, more discussion is the broad plan for this morning. To start, I wonder if someone would be willing, this is in the packet of materials, would someone be willing to offer this collect for the first Sunday of Advent? It comes from Stephen Shakespeare's collection of prayers for an inclusive church. Would someone just like to offer that this morning? Fran. Amen. Let's just pause, take a breath. Anything strike you about this collect for this first Sunday of the Advent season? That's exactly where I landed too. If you couldn't hear what Mary just said, she picked up this line, disarm our love of control. Hi, Mary Alice. Alice, I know. So, do you want to say anything more about that, Mary? Right. I don't think it's the exclusive purview of clergy to really love control, but there is a little bit of that too. Anything else strike you about this collect? Yes.
You know, even if it's an illusion of security, that we have a bit of an illusion of control. So, right there.
I think it could speak to what's happening now. Because of the pandemic, and we all need that, knowing that we can rely on God and not have to have such controls, because we're in a very controlled environment right now, which causes stress. And I do believe that this is very applicable for today.
That's a very interesting insight, Fran, that you just said, that a controlled environment can cause stress. You know what? I'm going to be pondering that a bit too. That could well be part of what's going on for a lot of us in terms of how we don't feel that we are in control. We're being controlled by circumstances. Francis?
I think that's causing a lot of our divisions because each side is trying to gain that control that they feel that they've lost, which is causing uncontrolled chaos.
Right. We can always come back to this if thoughts occur to you about this. I'm wondering if someone else would read this wonderful little excerpt from Stephen Charleston, which was also in your packet of materials. Stephen Charleston, as you may know, is a bishop in the Episcopal Church. He's also a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And is a prolific writer and a wonderful spiritual guide and elder. Would someone like to read this from his book, Ladder to the Light? Alex. Oh, yes. Ah, I should have created some for that. I'm sorry. Would someone like to read it? Great.
Don't let the dark clouds fool you. They may pretend to own the heavens, stretching from horizon to horizon, ominous and commanding, a permanent shadow over our lives. But I know their secret. There is a world of sunlight behind them. One day, when the wind of change pushes them apart, that light will return to bathe the earth, to restore the vision of every person, to set right that which has been broken. Stand firm in what you know and believe. Look up and do not be afraid. For when you feel the first breeze of hope, the clouds will soon be chased from the sky.
What strikes you about this, to me, amazing quote? That's right, yes.
Makes us hopeful for the wind of change.
Ah, he does connect change to hope, doesn't he? And it matters, I think anyway, that he belongs to the Choctaw Nation of indigenous peoples, so that given the, what adjectives to use, the traumatic history of indigenous peoples on this continent, for him to be able to write this way about hope is also very striking. Mary?
First it says they may pretend, and then the word a permanent shadow.
Ah.
Put those two, and so basically, it's an illusion.
Ah. I like that. So Mary's pointing to the words pretend and permanent here. So to notice that these clouds, the dark clouds, are pretending to have a permanent place in our lives. It's an illusion.
Just like what's happening now.
Yep. Alice.
Seems that, when we're going through hard times, you get that feeling like it's never going to be over. It's going to always be there. But when time passes, it does change. And, and I think this is where you find people who have so much mental illness
Thank you, Alice. Francis.
I mentioned there's a bluegrass gospel song called On Cloudy Day, and it goes where it's cloudy until you see the Lord, and then it becomes an uncloudy day.
I'm also reminded of Paul's letter to the Romans, in which he writes in the 8th chapter that hope is unseen. And that there's this sense in this quote that he's pointing to something for us that we can't presently see, and assuring us that it's there. Behind these dark clouds, he calls it a secret. Behind these dark clouds is the sunshine. And that there's something about the prophets, ancient Hebrew prophets, as well as Paul and others, who are trying to invite us, I think, to embrace what it is we cannot presently see or touch, which is difficult for us to embrace that, but the reassurance that it is nonetheless there. So I offered that first collect and this reflection from Stephen Charleston as a way to sort of just frame how we might think about apocalyptic together, and I'll connect some of those dots for us in a moment. I'm sure you're going to connect them as well. But I thought we'd just spend a few moments with the questions that I sent out with the packet of materials. And in that packet, you'll recall, was this piece from the Religion News Service by Thomas Rees about apocalyptic moments, both ancient ones and current ones, and then also about the piece from Rowan Williams and the wonderful poem from Linda Hogan. So before we sort of walk through those pieces together a little bit, I'm wondering if we could just discuss these rather broad topics together for just a few moments. And you can use these questions as launching pads to other questions you may have too. I don't want to restrict our time of having some discussion to just these. But what kinds of concerns do you have, how about that question, about climate change? Where do you see the effects of climate change right here where we're living? And those of you joining us online, wherever you may be, why would we be talking about this in connection to Christian faith? Why would we be doing that? Or anything that this evokes for you without being limited to these questions. Where would you like to jump into this mire?
That's an impossible, I mean, yeah. It's gigantic. It's hard not to see the effects down to Southwest Michigan. In fact, our son visiting from Houston said, so is the lake still rising? I mean, what's happening? And how can we not see the changes and be concerned?
Concerned. Mm-hmm.
I think I was affected by climate change about a year ago. When we had the flood where I lived in Raleigh.
Oh, yes.
And it rained and it rained, and I was terrified, really, because it didn't go away. I lost the car in that flood. I had a panic attack in that flood. But I survived it, but I think things are happening all over with flooding because of land and fires, and which has been caused by the dryness and the denial of climate change, I think, is a big concern. The denial itself that it's happening, and our countries not doing anything about it. It seems to me that we have basically somehow logically and mathematically disconnected creation with the environment.
Ah, interesting.
We've got creation,
Mm-hmm.
responsibility to care for it in all respects, and somehow we, on a daily basis, live in it, but we think about it as the environment, and yes, we do, whether we do that intentionally or unintentionally, because I think that the climate crisis is basically about how we live. And, you know, it doesn't have the immediacy, and this is terrible. Things like the word, right, have immediacy. This doesn't. And it's everything, I mean, from food we eat to the transportation that we take. And it also, on top of just destroying, creating an environment where there are floods, there are droughts, there are fires. There's also the issue of those who are probably creating the most damage are those who can, without thinking about the effect it has on those who can't, who are marginalized. So it has a more extreme effect on them. So it's, I think that's why the environment does have a lot to do with it.
You'll hear from Alex in his preaching this morning at 10:15. The reminder that biblical writers actually draw from the wider world of God's creation, the environment, to talk about apocalyptic things. And it sounds eerily like a documentary now when they do that. That's not Alex's word, that's my word. But and connecting Fran and Bobby's comment there for a moment, part of what is, I think, challenging about naming the realities that we're in is that much of what's happening actually has happened, is part of the natural order of how climate works on the planet. One of the problems is human-made climate change exacerbates patterns that are already present. So we have floods without climate change. We have extinctions without climate change. We have wildfires without climate change. The problem, however, is that because of human-made climate change, these are just now wildly out of control and way out of step with sort of natural processes. Just one example, it's actually the case that the way evolutionary biology works on this planet, extinctions happen all the time of species. It's actually a natural part of the evolutionary process of life on this planet. I was shocked to learn how much extinction happens all the time as just part of the natural process. For example, as many as 10 species of organism, plant and animal, go extinct every day because of evolutionary processes of life. It's a very vast, complex system. Because of human-made climate change, however, that number is now tenfold that. 100 species of either plant or animal are going extinct daily. To the point where, well, I don't even have to finish that sentence. It is unsustainable for planetary systems. Many of those species we don't even know about.
And they might be species that are essential to some other.
Right.
Or
Are there other ways that, oh, Alice, go ahead.
Well, I think that because, for instance, the lake houses go up and we have homes along the lake that fall in and then, so then the next set are further back and the next time the lake comes up, they go in. And I've seen this going on, for my life. And, so we kind of think, well, it's all going to be okay. And the thing is, it never goes back to where it was. But once it's gone, it doesn't, and that's true with the species, it's true with the land, and, yeah, and this is why it's so hard to convince people, because I see it in my own family. It's always happened, and it's like, yeah, but it's worse. It's getting big. It was, I think, 12 years ago, up in my neighborhood, we had this huge rain. And I'm lucky because I sit up a little bit. Everything from me just drains down to the neighbors behind me. But the water level is now so high for those who live down lower that one of the neighbors behind me, her basement is never dry. It is basically lost. And it's because over, and people who lived there 30 years before this happened, they've never had a wet basement. And now there's some who never had a dry basement. And you say that that's just ordinary. I don't think so. I know you don't do that.
And I think I'm intrigued by Bobby's comment too, that I hadn't thought of that there's some kind of a disconnect between talking about God's creation and the environment. I'm going to think more about that because that is intriguing, that there's some kind of people aren't connecting those in a way that probably would be much more helpful.
When you talk about the Christian faith, the word that we read in the Bible is that man was created to dominate, but is that really what the original word meant?
No.
I didn't think so.
Dominate probably, I mean, there is, well, and there are strands within biblical traditions that would certainly place humans in above other species and so on. So I don't want to sugarcoat biblical tradition.
But certainly not in the way that, say, modern Western society has dominated environmental systems.
No, but I think you can use certain examples where say things can change. For example, Lake Michigan was not the color it is today 40 years ago. It was a dark blue. You see the green and all that. When I lived on the south side of Chicago, you go swimming among little pieces of graphite and these things are floating in the water. You open your eyes, you can barely see. Nowadays, you can. The lake has been cleaned up. So I think you can also set examples that things can change. It's not hopeless.
And one of the great things you probably know during this pandemic, last year, there were some places around the world that we noticed, oh my goodness, healing can happen a lot quicker than we thought was possible in some of these ecosystems. So if we were to be even more serious about our engagement with ecological renewal, there's hope.
Small changes even.
Yes, that's right. So we can come back to these questions for sure, and we will. What I'd like to do is, and just jump in, by the way, with any additional comments or thoughts or questions you may have as we go along. I want to just make a couple of observations about why is this related to apocalyptic spirituality. here's where I am stealing a little thunder from Alex this morning, but I apologize about that. So, Apocalypse, as you probably know, has been associated with usually end-of-world disaster films. Think Mad Max and that whole series of Hollywood blockbusters. There's a whole, Hollywood is fascinated with apocalyptic equals disaster, and actually lots of religious traditions and communities have also picked up on that as well. And there are some good reasons for that. But I want to just sort of take a step back from the disaster movie genre for a moment and talk about what the word apocalypse actually means and its implications for our faith. So, it comes from the Greek verb, very simply, to reveal, or to unveil, or to uncover. I love Greek because it's not like English, which is a mess. English is like, it's a bunch of Latin and some German thrown in, Scandinavian languages, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. English is an impossible language. It's so inconsistent. Greek is super logical and very, you could even call it sort of architectonic. You build words with little pieces, chunks. So that's apocalypse, and apocalyptic is like that. So a calypse, the Greek noun calypse, is like a cover of something, a lid on a jar. Okay? Apo, the prefix, simply it means anything that is against or opposed to, or our word anti, for example. So think about this for a minute. You've got a lid on a jar. You're opposed to having the lid on the jar. You take it off. So you're revealing something. I like to think of the apocalypse as popping the lid off. Revealing, unveiling, uncovering something. And I also love that image of what does the earth disclose? The earth! But also then, how does this relate to the verb apocalypto, to reveal, to unveil, to disclose, was actually a very ordinary verb in everyday living. Someone in their household could use the verb apocalypto by taking the lid off a jar, literally. But then when it gets applied to things like human history or the cosmos, of course it takes on this much more hefty set of meanings and significations. There is, in many of the world's religious traditions, look at that sunshine, wow. In the world's religious traditions, strands of apocalyptic literature. And that is a very particular kind of religious literature. Again, it usually gets associated with disaster or the so-called end of the world. However, part of what I really find helpful about scholars who study apocalyptic literature is that it offers a community in crisis some reassurance that what they're going through belongs to a larger story. It's an attempt by apocalyptic writers to say, your struggle right now is not without meaning, and it's not isolated. It's part of a larger story of meaning. We can disagree, argue about the meanings that get assigned to that larger story, right? But I do appreciate the attempt and the desire to say, this belongs to a larger community of meaning makers. We're not alone. Apocalyptic literature is meant to assure us about that. Does that make sense about what apocalyptic is about? So think with me, imagine with me for just a moment a society that we might describe like this. A society in which there is a severe gap between those with excessive wealth and those living in grinding poverty. Imagine a society of an elite class of utterly corrupt politicians. You don't have to use your imagination too hard for that, perhaps. Imagine a truly xenophobic society that keeps fortifying its borders to keep people away. Imagine a society that is deeply afraid of strangers entering their country across their borders, who speak a strange language, perhaps they practice a strange religion. You might think that I am referring, perhaps you might, to the United States of America in the 20th century or even today. What I'm doing actually is describing the Roman Empire right before it fell in the early 5th century. And at that time, there was a lot of apocalyptic speculation about what that meant. What does this mean? Early 5th century was about a century after Christianity became something like the official religion of the Roman Empire. And the eternal city, Rome, many thought of Rome as at least a great example of, if not actually, the heavenly Jerusalem. That maybe the Roman Empire itself was portending the coming kingdom of God. So how could it fall? Especially, how could the eternal city have those barbarians at the gate? Those were my ancestors, by the way, from the northern Germanic tribes coming down to the gates of this. This was a deeply distressing existential crisis for Roman citizens, to put it mildly. Many were actually blaming Christians for the fall of Rome, because Christians had taken Roman citizens away from their old practices of different types of religious practice and so on. In any case, there was a theologian, of course, writing at that time, you may have heard of, Augustine, one of the major shapers of Western Christianity. And as this was happening, he took it as an occasion to write the now classic work, The City of God. It's the fall of Rome that occasioned him to write that. And one of his primary arguments in that book is that no earthly city is actually the city of God. No earthly city. But that through human history we can see signs and hints and evocations of that city of God still to come at the end of time. But do not make the mistake, he said, of assuming that any particular city is the city of God, earthly city. With me so far? So then the question might be, well, then what do we do? Well, this catastrophe is happening.
Play the violin.
You play the violin as Rome burns. Right. Actually, what Augustine recommends and urges in the city of God is for Christians to keep gathering at the Eucharistic table. As the empire falls, come to the table. And he says that, these are my words, but he's urging in the city of God is to create communities of courage, compassion, and deep collaboration at that table. And that's, by the way, I really appreciate this depiction of Augustine. He was, of course, the Bishop of Hippo, which is in North Africa, so it's at least possible, probable, maybe, that he was not sort of the white Northern European that he's usually depicted to be. In any case, what Augustine was urging is for Christians to create an alternative community at the table. If the empire is falling all around you, show the world what it looks like to build a different type of community. Show the world hints of the city of God that's coming but not yet here. Live differently in the midst of the ruins. To offer the world this alternative vision. And what it strikes me about this that I find so helpful is that in this vision of Augustine, apocalypse isn't something that happens to us. We ourselves are apocalyptic because we're revealing something about the city of God that's coming. I find that a very helpful way to sort of remove some of the sting of disaster from apocalypticism and instead to really embrace that notion of unveiling, disclosing, uncovering, revealing. Does that make sense? Sense, I don't know what sense means, but is it hopeful? Time's going to evaporate on us. I wanted to spend just a second. Oh, actually, we had it on slide. How about that? Apocalypse is not what happens to us, it's what we are. Revealers, disclosers, unveilers. By God's grace. That's the other thing. This is a trailer for the sermon. Alex, you can tell I really like what she did this morning. And he does this great thing of refusing to fall on either side of the binary trap of either God does everything and we do nothing, or we do everything and God does nothing. And Alex invites us into a great space this morning where it's a cooperative venture, maybe. I want to say just the Rowan Williams piece in the packet. I'll just say something very briefly about it, then I want to have some more conversation. It's a very short piece, but it's also, it takes a while to sort of figure out what the heck he's talking about, which is very typical Rowan Williams. But I also find it really engaging and insightful the more I thought about it. And he's talking about the nativity, of course, of Jesus. And he's got the title Inhabiting the Ruins. He makes reference, by the way, I never thought about this really before, so I read this piece. He makes reference to a significant strand of Renaissance paintings of the Nativity, in which the birth of Jesus happens in ruins. Right? Here's an example of all, it's not a very good one. But there are ruins all around. This is the adoration of the Magi. But it's in the midst of falling down buildings and ruins. So here's my take on his argument, the arc of his argument in this short little piece, and then I'd love to hear what you think about it when that passes. You can see a little bit better. There's the sort of stable and first point is, let's notice Renaissance paintings have the nativity in its ruins. And what he's urging us to do is to resist sentimentality when it comes to the nativity. Oh, look at the cute little baby at the manger and fluffy angels and so on. It says we're not going to get the significance of the nativity unless we look up and around us at the ruins. That God accompanies us in the midst of everything falling down. And if we're talking about ecological catastrophe and climate change, this is why it's so important to look up and notice, like we were doing just at the beginning this morning, naming the realities around us, to resist sentimentality, and to think about what God accompanying us in the flesh at this time in human history might mean. So notice the ruins, he says. And it's a strong urging, right? He says we have to live in the ruins. We have to not just see it, but really understand that we inhabit the ruins where God joins us. Because Advent, Nativity, is about a new world coming. It's not about the endorsement of the way things are. That's why it's apocalyptic. The apocalypse is the revealing of a new world coming. Not a stamp of approval on the way things are. To the contrary, a breaking open of something new coming. Is that how you read this piece? I can't remember what else. Here's where I'll end. And I love this Jesus sitting on a rainbow icon. It's the idea here is that Jesus, the Word of God made flesh, embedded in creation. So I'm inviting us in this three-part series and in this season to adopt a kind of apocalyptic ecology, by which I mean we ask ourselves what's being revealed in Earth's ecosystems right now. What do we see? How can we courageously name it, look at it, not hide from it, inhabit the ruins that have been made? How do we live there? We have to ask ourselves, how are we going to live in these ruins? Not in despair, but with hope. And where do we find that hope? I really appreciate that you mentioned those stories, Mary, that do give us hope about how we could be living differently and make a difference. And then to ask, how do we see Christ being incarnate with us, accompanying us in these ecological ruins? That's how I made the connection between what Rowan Williams invited us to do and our current ecological situation. Mess. So I'll stop there. See what you think. Or what you would add.
I thought the Rowan Williams piece that he had that quotes and that. I wasn't familiar with that quote that he was
Me neither, yeah.
talking about.
I want to pick it up, except it sounds like it's hard to read.
Yeah.
Those aren't typos.
But the idea of the sort of end of time ruins and what happens, I mean, an example of that kind of literature which I've read, but I wasn't familiar with it.
Because I'm sorry to say, at least for me, thinking
Thinking about all this, like, well, what's going to happen to humankind? What's going to happen to people in the midst of this process of extinction or change for the worse?
In our lifetimes, because it's actually starting to happen now, we're going to see climate migrants coming to the Great Lakes area. And not from other countries, but from our own country.
We already are.
And actually, it's one of the things that brought me here, quite frankly. Escaping California's wildfires was not my primary reason to come to the Great Lakes, but it was a bonus for sure.
We felt the same coming from Southern California.
Yep.
That there's water.
There's water here. There's no, do we all, I don't know if everyone really appreciates, there's no water in California. So the water table aquifers are spent.
When you
There
eat
isn't
at
any.
a restaurant in Pasadena, they don't bring you water. I mean, here, of course, they bring you water first. There, if you want water, you have to ask for it, and it's not assumed anywhere that you can, or that you could take a long shower or.
Naming some of these realities, as hard as it can be sometimes, is really important to do in order to reveal what's the ruins that we're living in, to be really clear about that, and to see what Christ incarnate in the world around us is calling us to do.
One of the things about me is that we have a recycle program here that is not a real, not in the church, but in this community. And they're not a really recycled program. Because they tell you that, oh, we'll take the glass out. Well, if they don't take the plastic out, what makes you think they'll take the glass out like they charge for the service, but there's no real service? So, it's lip service. That's the service.
Making us feel better by putting a blue can out of the
Yeah.
street side, but it may not be actually doing very much. I'm just loving the sunshine right now, coming through these windows. It's so beautiful. Speaking of hope and revealing light.
You know, I think one of the things that is so difficult for us who have lived here in this country all our lives is that we've been sort of encouraged and perhaps even taught to not look at the ruins, to look away. And in reading the Rowan Williams article, one of the, he said, if I'm prepared to spend time letting the freedom of God sink in. I thought that was really a compelling idea. Bobby, would you say that again? What is the what? I said that in this country, we have been more or less encouraged or educated to look away from the ruins, not to look at the ruins. And not to absorb what that means. And the Rowan Williams wrote, but if I'm prepared to spend time letting the freedom of God sink in, I thought that was really, it made me stop and think in the context of what he wrote about the ruins. Because I think that is our challenge today in terms
live in some ruins, but if you inhabit them, you are part of it. You live in it. It is part of you. You see it all the time in everything that you do. So I really like his choice of words there.
There's something, I'm really appreciating these comments because it's underscoring for me how important it is for us to cultivate this discipline of seeing clearly what's going on, inhabiting the ruins, noticing, naming. You know, the Thomas Rees piece, I think it's Thomas Rees piece that was in the packet from the Religion News Service, he was talking about there are ecological optimists and ecological pessimists, right? I actually don't think that binary choice is quite as helpful, and here's why. Because hope isn't included in that. Hope and optimism are not the same. And Martin Luther King Jr. actually really helped me a long time ago realize the importance of the distinction between optimism and hope, and it's related to this seeing clearly. So optimism, the optimistic posture is basically, you know, things are pretty okay just the way they are. We might need to make a few adjustments along the way, but we are on the right track. Right? That's optimism. The hopeful posture is basically never satisfied with how things are. Always restless. This is not right. This is not working, but I'm not sure how it's going to change. Martin Luther King Jr. was not optimistic about racial justice in this country, but he was hopeful. He was hopeful. So that in a similar fashion, if we can see clearly and name what's happening around us ecologically, that might awaken some hopefulness for a different way to live. That the path we're on is not toward thriving, flourishing life. And the hope is that we can find a different way to live. And maybe that's 10 o'clock. The amen that sounded. So, and welcome. I'm sorry I didn't say hello as you came in, but welcome. We were just finishing up our education forum this morning.
We look at mine, it says 10, so sorry, we're early.
Oh, we need to fix that, don't we? We definitely need to fix that. Thank you so much for being here and welcome this morning. And thank you. We'll be here again next week. Same time, same station. I'm saying online.